Okay, well this is no small topic, so I apologise straight away for this hodgepodge of a presentation, but hopefully there'll be a few takeaways. I presume I'll just... Okay. And of course, most of you know me as a paleoecologist, so I have to start in the deep past, just to tell you that the last 30 or 40 years isn't the only time that climate has changed. So if we look at sites that we've worked on in Western Victoria, down Pejack Marsh, down towards Warrnambool, this is a million-year record of pollen in Western Victoria, and it shows, amongst other things, that we have rainforest in Western Victoria, including Huon pine in the past, believe it or not, during wet phases. During wet phases there's also eucalyptus and she oak, but it swung over during dry phases to almost entirely daisy and grasses. And this has been swinging backwards and forwards for the last million years. The last 700 to 1,000 years it's done it on a cyclicity of 100,000 year cycles. So inevitably we'll run into an ice age, but it's not predicted for another 52,000 years. Also down at Warrnambool, Lake Wangoom, we can see on a sort of 80,000 year time frame various wet phases where we have eucalypts and she oaks, and in between periods of 20,000 years where Western Victoria was covered in grass and saltbush, being very dry and cool. So we swing between dry and cool and warm and wet typically, but unusually we're going into warm and dry, which is an unusual combination over these thousands of year time frames. At Tower Hill, during the last ice age, again dominated by grass and saltbush and daisies. Then as the climate warmed coming out of the ice age, it was dominated by saltbush. And then for 4,000 years, Western Victoria was completely covered with she oak as the dominant plant. And it wasn't until sea levels rose that eucalyptus got its foothold in about 6,500 years ago. So our eucalypt forests that we say are ancient are really only 20 generations old across this landscape. So what I want to point out here, there is incredible inherent resilience over long time frames of climate change driven by orbital cycles of the Earth around the Sun. So there's a lot of resilience in our ecosystems, thankfully. Similar sort of record at Mount Eccles, showing again eucalypts taking over about 6,000 years ago. And the marvellous Roger Jones did some work on the big lakes in Western Victoria, and he's reconstructed, believe it or not, precipitation to evaporation ratio in the top panel for the last 16,000 years. So when people say, oh, we've had all these climates in the past, well, Roger's PhD 20 years ago or so shows we know a lot about that. So effective rainfall in the Ice Age was much lower, then it almost doubled, and Western Victoria was awash for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Then it dried out again. The period 3,000 years ago was the last time it was this dry. Then the lakes filled up again, and now they've dried out again. And lakes like Lake Keelbeek down at Terang is in the order of 29 metres deep. 150 years ago, it's now 8 metres deep. It's a giant rain gauge that's lost 75% of its volume. So we've been drying for 200 years, not just the last 30. And we can point out long-term periods of change. We did an analysis of drought precedents over the last 1,500 years, and the red arrow shows that when Lake Colac dried out, that was unprecedented at the century scale. So it hadn't been that dry for 500 years. So we are in extraordinary times climatically. And if we look at Murray-Darling Basin water use, we can see in the top panel how rapidly we used water after the Second World War, but we did that when we had a lot of water around with high rainfall through what's known as a flood-dominated regime. Having allocated all that water, we then found ourselves in a drought-dominated regime, massively overcommitted, as we know, in the Murray-Darling Basin, and we've exceeded tipping points, as I'll show you shortly. Of course, the last drought-dominated regime lasted 50 years, so we can expect a bit more of drought challenge. And that goes with the known Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a known cycle of 30 to 50 years of flood and drought-dominated regimes, and we're probably still in the drought-dominated regime. If we look at temperature into the future in terms of runoff across southeastern Australia, if we get to 2 degrees warmer, and Will Steffen in the paper said today that that's almost inevitable now, at a 15% decline in rainfall, we're looking at a 25 to 50% decline in runoff across southeastern Australia, which is going to impact ecosystems massively. We've already seen from the paleo record shifts in ecological state in Murray-Darling wetlands, and Ralph Ogden's work 25 years ago shows all the deep and large wetlands across the upper Murray switched and lost all their aquatic plants very rapidly, certainly in the 1900s, if not in the 1800s. And the mechanism we invoke is that because of the mud, the turbidity, the light was obliterated and there was no light or energy for aquatic plants, and so in the large deep wetlands they all disappeared. If we're going to talk about resilience, what we have here is the breaching of a threshold and the system being locked into a new phytoplankton-dominated state when it once was a plant-dominated state. From our records, we've seen this to have occurred in about 80% of the wetlands in the Murray about 100 years ago. So these thresholds have already been exceeded on account of waste from mining and agriculture. Lower down, you can see these systems actually switching back when they dry. So ecologically, some systems can reset, whereas the large deep ones are continually inundated with muddy water and effectively locked in a phytoplankton state. That's quite scary. It partly explains the blue-green algae blooms we see in modern times, but blue-green algae blooms will be accentuated by increased concentrations of carbon dioxide and increased temperatures because they're more competitive under those environments. So the mechanisms we see here, if we're going to talk about resilience, is maybe it's just a continual dosing of sediments and nutrients down the system, and the wetlands can't recover because we just can't arrest the flux of pollutants. Or it could be a critical transition whereby the turbidity wipes out the aquatic plants. The aquatic plants were very good at keeping the water clear. A switch over to phytoplankton, which exacerbates the problem of light, and you get locked into a new state, which is very hard to change or resist. So that's what's called effectively a tipping point change or a critical transition. And we think that's most likely what's happened to these wetlands. And as I mentioned, we've looked at the different shapes and sizes of wetlands down the system. Over 60 sites we've examined, and we see which ones are sensitive to tipping points and which ones are not. So, drawing on a bit of Brian Walker's work from CSIRO and the Resilience Alliance, resilience has a clear definition. It's an ability of a system to recover from a shock and retain its identity. And it might be shocked to the point of exceeding a tipping point, whereupon it transitions into a new identity. And critically, we can have systems that just bubble along in a K phase, which is a phase where we manage a system by reducing redundancies, shedding redundancies, becoming more and more and more efficient, but ultimately, once shocked, it has no buttressing to resist the shock and it will completely tip over. The adaptive need in this situation is to have small adaptive cycles to fine-tune the system and so enable it to resist shocks and retain its identity. If it does exceed a tipping point, then it is released under the next phase, where there's a rapid release of resources and a new system is created, which is something we want to avoid. So to build resilience to avoid shocks, what's needed is not to shed redundancies, but to hedge your bets. Increase what is apparently redundant, but these are your adaptive capacity to changes into the future. So there's a bit of a balance between optimisation, which is what we've been doing the last 30 years. That went well with the global financial crisis, didn't it? So if you avoid optimisation but increase diversity, you actually hedge your bets when the shocks come. So wise leaders tend to identify risks. They identify the risks coming and they put in place adaptive capacity. They don't keep shedding redundancies, and as Brian Walker says, of course, Buffett's first rule of holes is when you're in trouble, stop digging. So resilience prescriptions don't pursue an optimal state. We've been doing that for the last 30 or 40 years, and so that's why we're at risk at present. Understand thresholds, facilitate self-organisation of systems, promote resilience, embrace change. Will Stephan himself says one of the things we do, because we can't forecast where we're going to be, we need to hedge our bets and just build in adaptive capacity. Prepare for transformation and enable adaptive governance. So, ecologically, building adaptive capacity might be increasing the genetic diversity of plantings, hedging your bets genetically, reducing turbidity in wetlands so that wetlands can adapt to changing temperatures and precipitation into the future, and controversially I say reducing fire, because fire generates fine fuels, and you can possibly work out how that positive feedback might work. Climate change adaptation may involve reducing stress from other drivers so that ecosystems can adapt to the ongoing pressures of climate. Planting habitat as short-term refugia for species that might have to move around the landscape, and last resorts, rescuing isolated populations, translocations, and seed and egg banks. I will get into fire, although that's a topic for later, but the ecology of fire is absolutely critical. We edited a book on rainforests of Victoria over 30 years ago now, and David Cameron, the rainforest ecologist, published The Anatomy of a Rainforest. And he described this as a trade-off between the sclerophyll on the ridge and the rainforest in the gully. In the absence of fire, the rainforest can moderate its own environment, keep the humidity up, and actually marches up slope. In the presence of fire, the sclerophyll itself advantages its own conditions and marches down into the gully and creates more fire prevalent conditions in the gully. So fire is the agent, but the plants themselves, because they're adapted to improve conditions for their own future, can influence how fire takes place. So David Cameron saw this as successional stages in the interaction between rainforest and wet sclerophyll forest. There's a couple of theories here, sorry for that animation. 1959, Tony Mount wrote the disclimax theory of fire ecology, and that was that eucalypts are so good at creating fire conditions that you'll never get to rainforest in a succession. Ultimately will burn and it will reset back to eucalypts. So there's this internal cycling or positive feedback by eucalypts to keep things fire prone. The Much hypothesis in the 1970 came out and said that the more you burn, the more you create fine fuel, and you end up locked in a highly flammable situation. David Cameron would say, if you don't burn, rainforests will come in and they will create a humid environment and perhaps protect themselves from fire. The bottom left panel, that's one giant shining gum in the middle of what was the biggest warm temperate rainforest patch in East Gippsland at Jones Creek. I ventured into there 6 months after the 83 fires with David Cameron, and there was a sapling of that one tree every 10 centimetres across the whole landscape. That whole system had reset from warm temperate rainforest to sclerophyll forest with one event. And if we abide by the disclimax theory of Mount, that will now perpetually be a sclerophyll forest, and that rainforest has gone, and the barriers to fire are also lost. We know that temperatures have driven climate for the last 70,000, fire rather, for the last 70,000 years, and fuel reduction burns may in fact unify the landscape and reduce diversity, and it would be the diversity that would help us manage fire into the future. So I'll finish saying that ecologically, resilience requires building ecological diversity. We need to avoid tipping points or recognise their approach and address positive feedbacks, because we lose control once those feedbacks are in place. I might have left a moment for questions. Thank you.